Hello, everyone. My name is Yukio Lippitt. I'm the Faculty Director of the Arts at the Radcliffe Institute and a co-organizer of this conference. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the final panel of today's conference, which is titled Gender, Media, and Popular Culture. Now, we have a terrific group of speakers that are going to address a complex nexus of problems, and we have the perfect moderator to introduce and moderate them. Professor Mary Jo Kane, whose full biography is listed in the booklet, the conference booklet, but I'll just say here, she is professor of sports sociology and the director of a unique center, the Tucker Center for Research on Girls and Women in Sports at the University of Minnesota, which she had a hand in founding, and her list of publications on the subject of sports and societies is extensive, and her contribution to sports education in general are really immense and multifaceted. All of us as educators at Radcliffe hold her in the highest regard. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mary Jo Kane and the panelists.
Before I begin my final remarks, I want to say that over 30 years of being in higher education and going to countless conferences, and as the director of the Tucker Center, hosting a few conferences myself, I know event management. And I just have to say that I told this to Becky last night. When you come here to the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University as an outsider, you are dealing with the A team. So how about a round of applause for all those folks? The opening sentence on the invitation to this conference reads as follows: "The degree to which sports permeate societies has never been greater, making it a revealing lens through which to understand many contemporary issues." The contemporary issues that we are going to examine this afternoon is sport, media, and gender. I'll set the stage with a general critique of what sport media scholarship has produced over the last 40 years regarding media representations and how they impact the way we think about female athletes as part of a larger critical analysis regarding sport, gender, and power in the post-Title IX era. My remarks will be followed by Professor Mike Messner, who's a sociologist at the University of Southern California, who will discuss change and continuity in the coverage of men's and women's sports. Mike's remarks will be followed next by Professor Rachael Miyung Joo, who is in American Studies at Middlebury College, and she will discuss how female golfers are represented in US and Korean media while exploring links among gender, race, and nationalism. Finally, Kavitha Davidson from ESPNW will highlight the decisions the media make that affect representations of women's sports, ranging from which sports they cover to how they frame that coverage. And then we all know the drill. After we're done, I'll lead us and have the panel members talk for about 15 minutes, and then we will open it up for a public Q&A. Over the last 4 decades, sport media scholars have amassed an increasingly sophisticated body of knowledge regarding the symbiotic connections among sport, gender, and power. We moved beyond descriptive content analysis-driven studies, which examine the frequency of coverage given to women's and men's sports, to scholarly lines of inquiry that were grounded in critical feminist theory. This particular analytic framework argues that society is structured around a series of inequitable relationships of power where women are systematically devalued and marginalized. We made the empirical and theoretical case that sports serve as an ideal site for the connections between gender and power because sport vigilantly maintains gender as hierarchically ordered, but more importantly, grounded in the physical body and thus perceived as biologically, meaning inherently based. We also argued that media representations play a critical role in perpetuating these notions of a biologically based gendered hierarchy, where in spite of the enormous progress that has been made 2 generations removed from Title IX, women remain second-class citizens in one of the most powerful economic, social, and political institutions on this planet. In sum, as Mike Messner has insightfully pointed out, female athletes and media representations of their body became and remain contested terrain. Let me just take a few minutes to talk about what we as sport media scholars have amassed, again, over the last 40 years. And we found 2 overarching patterns of media representations given to women's sports. First, female athletes are significantly underrepresented in that, for example, even though 43% of all scholarship athletes in college sports nationwide are women, they receive only about 2 to 4% of overall coverage across the vast and ubiquitous sport media landscape. And Mike Messner's work, his longitudinal work, will point that out. Second, within this coverage, female athletes are significantly more likely than males to be portrayed off the court, out of uniform, and in highly sexualized poses. Let me just give you a couple of examples of what I mean by that. That's also Lindsey Vonn. And next, from the team sport of soccer. And then look at how you feel when you see that they're juxtaposed. So let me close by highlighting the impacts of these kinds of images. I began my remarks by pointing out that sport serves as a critical site for reproducing notions of gender and power differences. But what is often overlooked, and this is absolutely essential for any analysis going forward, is how sports can also serve as a critical site for subverting these very ideologies and practices. When media images and narratives emphasize women as highly skilled and physically powerful athletes, they are directly challenging and profoundly threatening to belief systems that have and continue to relegate sportswomen to the sidelines. And that is because when we sexualize female athletes, it takes away from an incredibly powerful and reaffirming moment of women's physical capacities and turn it into something that is a moment of triviality and marginalization. I would suggest to you that until we see a plethora of images that reflect the reality of women's participation, they will never receive the full respect and admiration that they not only richly deserve, but that they have also earned. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I echo what Mary Jo and other people have all been saying about how wonderfully organized this day has been, and you know how fabulous the previous sessions have been. My comments will build on, I think, and possibly echo some of the points that were made earlier this morning. It's great, especially I just wanted to mention, as a former basketball player and someone who loves basketball still, to be in this building. It's fun to imagine this as a place where basketball was once played, and to sort of hear the echoes of the balls slapping on the wood floors here. I really love that sense of history as well. I wanted to start with a little anecdote. I'm going to talk about kind of more longitudinal study of sports media that I've been involved in, but I wanted to start with an anecdote that kind of sets the stage for me that happened just a few days ago. I live in South Pasadena, California, and I do my grocery shopping at a grocery store called Ralph's, and often when I'm at the checkout stand, people are talking sports, and some of the checkers sometimes will all dress in like football jerseys during Super Bowl, or they'll be talking about USC and UCLA, who's going to win the big game, and if it's basketball season, they're always talking about the men. And so I will sometimes say to one of the checkers, well, yeah, you know, I like the UCLA and USC rivalry, but I'm really interested in the women's game. I go to all of the USC women's basketball games, and usually that comment falls pretty flat, and oh, you know, is kind of the usual answer, and then they give me my change. I was standing there, though, the other day after the semifinals of the women's tournament, and in the check stand behind me, I heard this man saying to the checker, "Did you see that game yesterday?" I thought he was going to be talking about something else, but it was the game that I watched. He said, that little Morgan Williams just nailed that shot and just, you know, put the dagger in UConn. And then the checker said, yeah, I watched that. That was so great, wasn't it? And then I think I hurt my neck whiplashing. I want to get into this conversation. And so I said, yeah, wasn't that great? I mean, she was so awesome, but even more so in the game before against Baylor, where she hit 41. And one of them had watched that too, and we bonded around that. And I thought, wow, this is quite an amazing moment. And I think it's a sign of change one anecdote, but it's a sign of change that reflects the fact that women's basketball, not just the Final Four, but throughout the regular season now, we can watch women's basketball on television. Where I live, there's a Pac-12 network. We can watch regular season games, which helps to build a storyline that creates an interest and a fan base for when the Final Four happens. 20, 30 years ago, if you watched the Final Four, it would have, for the women, it would have been on tape delay, really poor production values, with no opportunity to watch regular season games. And it's like it's dropping in from Mars into your living room. So now it's quite a different experience. On the other hand, I think all the things that we've heard today and some of the data that I'll give you in a moment suggests that it's not quite time for the feminist victory lap. I've been working with some colleagues around this idea that instead of thinking of the social changes that have taken place over the last 30 years in sport and in other parts of our society, we've neither experienced a revolution nor we experienced a sort of stalled revolution as some people are talking about, but really instead we're experiencing what I call social change that is incomplete. And in many of these sort of bullets you see up here are things that have been that are repeating things that have been said today. But in youth sport, an area that I've studied, there's been this huge boom of girls, and yet there's this continued inequities in sex segregation and other sorts of parts of youth sports that really have not yet transformed, and particularly the new research that's developing on transgender kids and their families' struggles to get into a binary divided youth sports system. Sports leadership, as several people have pointed out today, at the high school and college level has really is still largely in male hands, athletic directors, head coaches, and in the media, we see an expansion, as I said, in some areas, like the coverage of women's hoops, which I really applaud as a fan, but on the other hand, we see still continued silences and poor quality coverage of women's sports. So I'm really kind of interested in understanding that unevenness of social change, why and how social change happens more rapidly in some sectors and not so much in others. And sports media is just one of the places I think we can think about that. I'm going to talk about a study that a couple people here today, Donna Lopiano and others, have referenced that I've done over the years. It's a 25-year study now. We're going to do it again in 2019. Most recently, I did it with Cheryl Cookie and my graduate student, Michael Amusto. The citation for that is on here. You can download that on Communication and Sport website. And it's basically a study that started, and it was first sponsored by what was then called the Amateur Athletic Foundation of Los Angeles, later LA 84 Foundation, that Anita DeFrance, who you met this morning, was the president of for many, many years. And it started out as a study, a content analysis basically of the 3 network affiliate news stations, early evening and late night news shows. And then a little bit later, we added ESPN SportsCenter because we realized people were getting a lot of their sports news from SportsCenter. Next time we do it, we're determined to add one more thing, and I think it's because we're learning that younger people especially are getting a lot of their sports information online, and so what's the most sort of general source of sports news? I think it might be ESPN.com, so we'll probably add a content analysis of that next time as well. But the point is that we've come out with this study every 5 years, and so we're able to track both the quantity and the quality of coverage of men's and women's sports in news and highlight shows over this period of time at 5-year intervals. And what we've seen, it's not a very pretty picture, frankly. The top line there, I'm colorblind, but I think that's blue, is, am I right? Yes. Okay, thank you. Is these 3 network affiliate shows, early evening, late night shows, and you can see that 1999-2000, we were starting to feel a little bit optimistic, and everybody was asking us to interpret, is this an upward slope that's just going to keep going up? Suddenly it's up to a whopping 8.7%, and we weren't quite sure how to interpret it, but then it dropped off again the following time and then has plummeted in recent years to a much lower level in the last 2 iterations of the study. ESPN SportsCenter pretty much flat at around 2% of the time devoted to the coverage of sports devoted to women's sports. When women's, or here's a sort of like what actually is covered in terms of sports. This is combining the news and highlight shows. And as some people have mentioned earlier today, it's the big 3, really, for the most part. Men's basketball, men's football, men's baseball are getting the whopping proportions of coverage on these shows. And this is just the 2014 numbers, but if you look at this over time, one of the things you see is that big 3 has taken up a larger and larger proportion of coverage over the years, rather than smaller. And I think part of this has to do with a kind of timidity in the newsroom and in these shows, that they're kind of going with the most comfortable and familiar types of sports, and it might, I don't think with ESPN this is probably an issue, but with the TV news shows it might be just like with newspapers, declining revenue and declining labor to cover certain kinds of things. I read the LA Times every day, and they can count on at least 1 letter from me every year during basketball season. Why aren't you covering women's sports in the regular season? If one of the local teams gets into the NCAA tournament, then they will start covering it. But the answer I usually get from the editor is, A, not that many people go to the games, and B, we just don't have the staff anymore to cover that, so we have to just sort of take the little piece of news that comes from the team itself and put that in the newspaper. And my argument all the time back to them is the chicken and egg argument that people oftentimes have with media about audience building, and how when things are covered more, people learn more about them, and newspaper is an important part of that web of information, as are TV news and highlight shows that build interest and a sense of history and a sense of audience buy-in to these forms of entertainment. Another thing that we found in the study, and this is again just the 2014 data, but it's very similar in recent iterations of the study, is that men's sports tend to get covered even when they're out of season. There's lavish coverage, and this is just a comparison of the WNBA and the NBA coverage, but we did this with some other sports too, but this is kind of a good apples and apples comparison in a lot of ways, even though the WNBA season is much shorter. But you see a lot of coverage, for instance, also of Major League Baseball when it's out of season. The LA Times, again using a sort of print example, has front page sports section stories on USC football and UCLA football in the springtime during spring practice, and then in months leading up to the season, building the sense of excitement about the first kickoff. And women's sports, when they do get covered, are covered only within the season, and then it just kind of evaporates and goes away. So again, a kind of audience building, interest building factor. The most interesting thing I think we have seen over time is it's kind of simple and easy to, well, I'll say this since the research assistants who've done the hard work on this project over the years aren't here with me, sitting there and watching videotape hours and hours and hours and coding it. But the data are quite simple for this sort of study, the quantitative data, but teasing out qualitative patterns and changes over time has been especially interesting. And one of the things that we've noticed has been there's a decided shift over time in the ways that women's sports are covered on news and highlight shows when they're covered at all. And you saw those numbers that they're not covered very much, but when they're covered at all, some of the major patterns that we've seen are, in those early iterations of the study, we saw a tremendous amount of just kind of making fun of and, quote, humorous joking and sexualization and trivialization of women's sports and women athletes. There's lots of examples of this in earlier iterations of our study. A big long story on a woman who's a nude bungee jumper off of a bridge or something, and then in a week where there's no coverage of any other women's sports, that sort of thing. And then by 2010, you see a decline, not a disappearance, but a decline of that sort of trivializing and overtly sexualizing and making fun of women's sports. And the dominant sort of narrative for talking about women's sports at that time becomes talking about women in these very well-accepted kind of, quote, traditional sorts of gender frames. Women as the girl next door, women as somebody's mother, women as somebody's girlfriend or wife, a woman athlete. And so you see interviews, when there are interviews on the news and highlight shows with a woman athlete, that focus a lot on a high-profile woman or highly successful woman athlete. You know, you're a mother. You know, how do you possibly do it? Talk about your child. Tell us about your role as a mother, which of course is fine if they just did that with men athletes too, I think. And I tell my students who are going into sports journalism, I said, when you find yourself in the locker room with LeBron James after the championship, ask him, LeBron, how do you do it? You know, aren't you a father? You know, and so you know, it's like it boggles me. You can be this great an athlete and still have a child. You know, so I mean, a lot of this is just about asymmetries of the way we talk about and talk to and frame women and men athletes. And then the most recent iteration of this study, we were very interested to find a lot less and almost no really insulting and sexualizing frames and presentations of women athletes in these shows. That had gone away almost entirely. And I think news shows in particular, I think they have been criticized a lot for this, and they've kind of pulled back on it. But what we have seen is a little bit of that kind of ambivalent wife-mother sort of framing. But instead, the main finding that we had in terms of the qualitative coverage of women's sports in these shows was just that it was very, very dull. Really boring in the way it got presented. Not very much visuals, kind of maybe just a brief, monotone kind of report. You know, and so the comparison, it looks something like this. You have a few minutes on a news show or a full hour on ESPN Sports Center where you just have bang, bang, bang stories about men's sports that have all these popping visuals and all this exciting commentary. And it reminds me, and we wrote this in the article, that all the superlatives and the high action commentary reminds me, and some of you are old enough to remember this, of the old Batman show on TV, the kind of bam, pow, wow, you know, and that sort of action stuff that you see. And ESPN's really quite good with this, with their visuals, and with their and then oh yeah, and the women played today too. You know, and the voice, it literally flattens out. And so we call this gender bland sexism, you know, kind of taking off on the terms about racism that are very similar today. So you have really this sort of active audience building happening with men's sports and very boring sort of commentary on women's sports. And it's almost as though when they decided or someone told them that they couldn't or shouldn't insult or sexualize women or trivialize women athletes, that they just decided not to cover them very much at all. And if they did, they would do so in a voice that communicated their lack of interest. Let me just say, just the last thing then is that I think we also, in terms of textual analysis, that's what we're looking at here, but we also need to think about production and, you know, what it means to have the kind of decisions that are made in newsrooms, print and electronic, and we need to think about consumption and you know, how it is that people read. Like that guy that I saw in the grocery store, how did he get excited about women's sports, and how did he make his way into that program and get so excited about it? And SportsCenter to me is you know, a research question I have about SportsCenter, to what extent men consumers experience that as a kind of man cave that insulates them from the changes that are going on in the world around them that are all about the empowerment of women. So out of time, and I will stop at that then. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you for being here on this beautiful Friday afternoon and staying for this final panel. I'm really excited to be on this panel with some of my idols who have been so central to the field. And I am here to build on some of the fantastic discussions we've had thus far. And I'll be focusing on media representations of transnational female athletes who compete in the United States. And by transnational, I mean either foreign to the United States, on temporary work visas, naturalized immigrants, or the children of immigrants who continue to have connections to their homelands. Transnational female athletes raise important questions about the connections between race, nation, and gender. And I'm going to base my statements on my own research on Korean female golfers in the Ladies Professional Golf Association, or the LPGA. And I'll also suggest that researchers and critics should attempt to foster relationships with journalists, athletic personnel, and feminists in other countries in order to engage in a process of transnational critique when discussing gender and sports. So in 2014, a New Zealander was the youngest to win an LPGA tournament at the age of 15, and 2 years later, at age 17, she became the youngest professional golfer, male or female, to hold the world's #1 spot. The golfer is Lydia Ko, who is a New Zealander born in South Korea. The AP has referred to her as a transplanted New Zealander, and given the complexities of globalization and sports migration, she's referenced as a Korean-born New Zealander, as a Korean golfer with New Zealand citizenship, as simply a Korean golfer, or as she refers to herself, as a Korean Kiwi or a Kowi. Lydia Ko bucks the notion of the apolitical and post-political Asian athlete. She won a spot in Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People in the World in 2014. And since the beginning of this year, she has begun to publicly advocate for equal pay. As the #1 female player in 2016, she was the only woman among the top 50 highest earning golfers, and she ranked 44th on the pay scale. She made a minor splash in New Zealand, United States, and Korean language media when she entered into the equal pay debate, and her advocacy for female professional athletes placed her in media articles where she was quoted alongside the great Billie Jean King. For Lydia Ko, gender has become a category for connecting her various national, ethnic, and racial ties. As with many top female athletes, she underwent a makeover with increased coverage and rising fame. She was signed by IMG, and to kick off 2015, she ditched her trademark big glasses for contacts and what is commonly referred to as a double eyelid surgery. She received the surgery in South Korea, where she also received acupuncture for her wrist. The Korean newspaper Joseonilbo stated in a rather perfunctory way, Ko said her caddy didn't even recognize her at first, as she wore glasses for about 5 years. For a number of teenage Korean girls and increasingly boys, this procedure takes place as a kind of rite of passage. And in South Korea, the inability to recognize someone after surgery is so commonplace that the government has mandated that individuals have their national identity cards reissued upon plastic surgery to the face. Pre- and post-op photos like these of Lydia Ko are ubiquitous on ads in public spaces, in beauty magazines and websites, and on personal social media where individuals proudly post their own pre- and post-op photos. And so these makeover images hardly cause a stir. In mainstream Korean context, the general attitude towards these surgeries is that they are a positive demonstration of aspiration, if not necessary as an economic strategy, to get ahead in a culture that greatly values appearance and a culture that generally assumes that the features you are born with are not destiny. It's fascinating to compare Ko to the previous #1 golfer, Inbee Park, who is also a history-making golfer. And this is a picture of Inbee. Inbee Park is hardly recognized outside of Korean golfing contexts, and while she was at the top of her game and will certainly be in the Hall of Fame, she made comparatively little in advertising. Park Inbee, or Inbee Park, defiantly resisted outside pressure to adjust her weight and her looks pointing out that a previous attempt to diet had been disastrous for her game. She dismissed criticisms of her lack of effort, stating that money or fame was never her motivation for entering the sport. Ko's surgery certainly highlights the truism that Mary Jo Kane and Michael Messner have proven again and again, that while it takes athletic talent to rise to the top, female athletes continue to be judged by their looks, and that female athletes themselves actively participate in the system given its financial rewards. Yet her surgery also points to the common practice of eyelid surgery for Korean and Asian females the world over. While it is certainly a racialized practice, it needs to be understood within a Korean political economy of images as an attempt to project a kind of global Koreanness by adhering to a particular standard of appearance. I remember being in Korea and being told by a Mongolian woman that I did not look Korean, but rather more like a Mongolian. And I have also been told that I need to fix things as though somehow there was something wrong with my natural face. This had more to do with the fact that I was not conforming to the standards of Korean beauty at the time, and many critics see Ko's surgery as an attempt to look more, not as an attempt to look more Western, but to conform to the manner of Korean beauty that's defined by Korean actors and K-pop movie stars. There are more important distinctions to be parsed out with respect to the different ways her gender and gender practices associated with her are understood depending on national context. Most Koreans consider her Korean regardless of nationality because of her familial ties to Korea. She is understood as part of the education exodus of families that leave to educate their children in an Anglophone country. As a golfer, she is seen as one of the many top Korean heritage female players who entered and dominated the LPGA since the debut of Seri Park in 1998. She was initiated into the game by her golf-obsessed uncle and aunt who reside in Seoul. She is known to be obsessed with K-pop and Hallyu stars, or the Korean wave of popular culture celebrities. She received plastic surgery and acupuncture in Seoul. She enrolled at one of the top universities in the nation, Korea University, in 2015, most likely because they will allow her to do her studies extramurally. And for Koreans, there's no doubt that her great golfing success hails from her Koreanness, and her New Zealand citizenship is seen as a matter of convenience or an economic strategy. Yet she has been embraced as a Kiwi and has likewise been embraced as a New Zealander who has bolstered its multicultural and immigrant-friendly image. She has been attributed with bringing the LPGA to the country. She immigrated to New Zealand at 6 years old and gained citizenship at 12. She is a national icon and recognized as one of the top athletes of the nation. She won at the Australian Open in 2015, which has always, brought a lot of pleasure to the New Zealand national public. For New Zealanders to win on Australian soil, it's a big deal. She won a silver medal in Rio and was named Young New Zealander of the Year in 2016. Her gender is significant as she is one of the few female Kiwi athletes to rise to any global acclaim given the overwhelming dominance of the male sports of rugby and cricket. Yet even this identification with New Zealand is understood as fungible. When asked about whether she might represent South Korea in future Olympics, she has said, "There have been players in the past who have gone back to Korea. There have been questions to me about changing my nationality back to Korea, but at the end of the day, the players who did it thought it best for them. I'm proud to have New Zealand on my bag." She continued, "I started golf in Korea, but did most of my development in New Zealand, and where New Zealand golf was very supportive, and they are still supportive now. So it's kind of hard to leave that behind. Obviously, when someone looks at me, they see a Korean face. I'm proud to be born in Korea and to represent New Zealand, and that's something I'm fortunate to have, support from two amazing countries. I'm a Korean Kiwi, or as we say it, Kowi." This self-naming practice as a Korean Kiwi, or Kowi, is reminiscent of Tiger's cablination and highlights a similar attempt to reduce any real tension or politics around her national identity. Clearly, a preoccupation of US media and Anglophone golf media is that idea that Asians are actually always originally from Asia, And while she is New Zealander by nationality and has enrolled at a Korean college, much of her training takes place in Florida and the US, and she spends much of her time on a US-based tour. Within the US, she is perceived as one of many players of Asian heritage who are shifting the cultural makeup of professional golf and also opening markets to Asia for US-related golf interests or US golf-related interests. She has been signed by the New York-based talent management company IMG, who famously signed Korean-American Michelle Wie in her teens, and she has also been accused of acculturating to the US, and in an interview confessed, "I think I got an American accent somewhere." In the United States, she is read through the lens of race in ways that continue to characterize the presence of Asians as temporary and as perpetual foreigners. As Asian females, they're without exception associated with their family and often over-determined by their culture, rather than seen as world-class individual athletes who have cultivated their talent through hard work and grit. They are often infantilized and objectified as cute little Asians available for a kiss, as you see in this image. While the LPGA presents itself as the ultimate destination for female golfers, for many Korean players, they have the opportunity to make more in South Korea. So they have to make a very difficult decision about whether to remain in the LPGA. Should they try to win a major tournament in the LPGA while they suffer in anonymity, or should they play in Korea, where opportunities for making money through sponsorships, television, spots, golf clinics, and pro-ams are much more frequent? Because they are lumped together as Korean female golfers, even top golfers are largely ignored by US sports media unless they are number one or especially attractive. So what I've tried to do is to highlight various national contexts for understanding how race, gender, and nation operate in golf. And I could go on, but I'm just going to end here. But I just wanted to suggest that for academics, journalists, and critics in the United States or in Europe or in the West, it's highly problematic to make a universal gender critique about gender inequality in sports without addressing the complexities of gender and race and national differences and the scale of those important identities for these players themselves. So I just want to encourage us to think about how to offer a gender critique in sports that's in conversation with critics, journalists, and athletes who reside in places where these athletes are coming from or where they've migrated to, and also who represent underrepresented communities. So, thank you.
Hi, I'm Kavitha, and I guess I'm ESPN's diversity hire. So I think that we've been talking about access to women's sports all day, and now we're obviously talking about coverage. And it's impossible to talk about either of those things without talking about the women fan. And the thing that underlies all three of these things is really that antiquated notions about these people, about these aspects of women in sports and their fandom and who covers them and how they're covered, are still kind of rooted in the idea that sports are a place for men and the rest of us are just visiting. So the female fan who knows all the stats and all the players and has a ton of experience talking about sports, she's the outlier. The female athlete who is dominant in her game, she's also the outlier. You know, not everybody is Serena. The idea that women can cover sports analytically and not just be sideline reporters, that's also an outlier. So, you know, I think that we have a lot of these issues to kind of unpack here, and it all really does come down to who the fans are and recognizing that and how that can translate to better coverage. So, not to be too simplistic, but this problem can kind of be broken down to two prongs. The fiscal undervaluing of women's sports and the cultural undervaluing of women's sports. And the two are really interrelated. And I'm going to start with the fiscal undervaluing, because I used to write sports for Bloomberg, and if you think the sports journalism industry is homogeneous, the finance sports journalism industry is even more so. And ideally, you know, we could make a purely moral argument for why we should have equal coverage, equal pay, equal respect for women's sports. But when you're trying to make a purely moral argument to bankers, that doesn't really go over well. So you kind of have to appeal to that other side of them. So management in the industry, and this is throughout the industry, and we're talking television, radio, print, online, everything, including advertising, and I'll get to that because that's a huge driver of what we're seeing here. Management tends to argue that women's sports don't draw big ratings, they don't draw high traffic numbers, they don't get enough clicks, and they don't generate revenue. And that's the reason, that's the justification essentially for prioritizing men's sports over women's sports. You know, people don't watch them, so why should we force them to, and why should we take up valuable airtime when we could be airing things like poker? The problem with this mentality is that it's also, as Michael said, the ultimate chicken or the egg thing. You know, if you give more exposure, do proper promotion, schedule games when people would actually watch them and are at home, my God, people would have more familiarity with these amazing athletes and with these games and with these things that we want to cover. And yes, sometimes with the human interest stories and the backstories that do make some of these figures really compelling. It bears out with the success of ESPnW, and that's one of the sites at ESPN that I'm lucky to work for. I also write for the magazine and for .com. But you know, we've seen incredible growth in traffic in the last few years, and as a result, we've seen a lot more on-air coverage, a lot more online coverage, and a huge expansion into how our women's content kind of permeates other areas of the company. I can personally, anecdotally attest to the idea that more coverage will generate more interest. And it's the same game that Michael was talking about. I have a bunch of guy friends who are always asking me, help me get more into women's basketball. And I think mostly it's just to get me to shut up about women's basketball. But, you know, so I'm watching Mississippi State UConn and I'm texting all of them to turn on the television. And they do. And, you know, I'm watching at home because I want to watch in peace and I want to yell at the TV when I want to and everything and have the sound on. After the game finishes airing, I go to my local bar where most of them were. And they had the sound on and they had the post game on and they had, you know, all the interviews on and everyone's going crazy. And these are guys rooting for teams that they've never watched before, athletes they couldn't name, cheering at the top of their lungs. And, you know, this was an incredible thing to see. It's not just the interest that generates, though. This is very tangible. It carried, ratings for that game were up 90% from the year before. And they were the highest Final Four ratings for the women's tournament in 5 years. It carried into the title game 2 days later. Ratings for the championship were 20% higher than last year's, and it was the most streamed women's game ever. And that's important because I think that our generation does not consume sports mostly on television. We don't get our news there, we don't get our games there largely. We get them online. So the fact that this game and where the future of where we see this industry going is online, and that this women's game was the most streamed game ever is a testament to how powerful just being able to see you know, how incredible these games and matchups and exciting things can be. And that game, you know, that game was everything you want out of sports. It was drama, it was compelling, it was unexpected, it was historic, it was improbable. And those are the kinds of things that we can get from women's sports that we already know we can get from men's sports. If people knew how exciting these games could be, more people would want to watch them. And that's more viewers, more readers, and honestly, most importantly, more targeted consumers for advertisers. The difficulty here is that it's really hard to change the game plan among management without hard evidence. And you can't really get that hard evidence without observing some of the anecdotal behavior that we've talked about, and also taking a leap of faith that women's coverage is worth it. My problem with that part of it is that there have been numerous leaps of faith over the years that have gotten men's sports the profitability and the popularity where they are now. People always forget that it took Major League Baseball and football more than 50 years to actually reach profitability, and they did so with huge government intervention, antitrust exemptions, tax exemptions, some of which still exist today. Women's sports have not received any of that kind of support. I will say the WNBA has had incredible support from the NBA, but come on, we're not talking about a league-wide antitrust exemption. Similarly, 31 million people watched Game 7 of the NBA Finals last year. 31 years ago, in 1986, CBS was tape delaying NBA playoff games. For context, I wasn't born then. Neither was the WNBA. The WNBA is 21 years old, was established in 1996. So we're talking about a sport that can go from being on tape delay to having 31 million people watching it in a span of 30 years, and we're not even willing to give the WNBA a chance for 20 years of reaching profitability. Besides that leap of faith, there are some tangible arguments we can make, both to media and the advertising industry, that drives our profit. And we can do this in showing that we're shortchanging both women's sports and women's fans, and that that's short-sighted, that we're leaving money on the table when we do so. So we did some preliminary research. We've been doing research at ESPN for years now on the women fan, and I can share a couple of things with you. And the biggest number is half of all sports fans, literally half of all sports fans are women. That's 115 million people. That's a huge growth market there. And that's something that's being overlooked that we have to stop overlooking as an industry. If you already have a pretty well-established audience and a consumer base, I think we can all agree it can be better catered to, even among the women who are currently watching. But perhaps more importantly, women fans are growing at rates higher than men's fans, and in certain breakdowns of the demographic, the men's fans are actually declining in areas where the women's fans are going up. Women fans are also raising in size and avidity. Now, what that means is that the number of fans who are going from casual to average to strong sports fans is on the rise, and those are the people that we can absolutely capture loyalty-wise. The Title IX generation largely accounts for this. As you can imagine, former athletes tend to be the most engaged in women's sports. These women say, by and large, that they're sports fans for life because they played sports growing up. That's a sports fan for life. That's exactly what Christine was talking about when she was on stage with Layla, is that these are the women that we should be catering to especially. As the participation rates of female athletes go up, so too will the fandom and the viewership and the consumer base. So it's no secret that in every facet of media, even sports media, which has long seemed untouchable, the shift toward cord cutting, toward going online, away from print to digital, away from digital to social media and video, is causing a lot of media companies to try and reevaluate how they can reach new populations and new viewers and new consumers. And the women's market obviously represents a huge potential for that. It seems counterproductive to leave the needs of a group of millions of fans that's only getting larger unattended simply because we don't look like what you think a sports fan usually looks like. So here's the point where I have to interject with an appeal specifically to advertisers about the value of the female fan. I interned at Nielsen Sports doing consumer and viewership insights, and I can't tell you how many times I was sitting in a room with a bunch of male ad execs trying to convince them that yes, women might not drink the beer, but they're the ones buying the beer, so maybe don't offend us in the commercials. I understand where their mentality comes from, even if it is archaic. We all know that the ad industry tends to uphold the male 18 to 24 demo as its main target, but it's finally coming around to the reality that even if women don't watch sports, and that's obviously a very dubious if, we buy a lot of things. It's not just the household products. We buy a lot of things. We make those purchasing decisions, and that's really important that advertisers start to come around to realize. Among female sports fans, 3 groups tend to be the most engaged. This is one of my favorite stats from one of our reports. Women 25 to 34, African American women as a whole, and moms with kids 6 through 17. Women 25 to 34 are increasingly being coveted. They're coming around to that at least. They might be highly educated, high earning, single, professional, or they might belong to the group of women that are getting married and having kids and starting families much later than they were before. Either way, they have really high purchasing power. Meanwhile, African American women are largely ignored all over the place, whether it's as consumers of products or as consumers of media. So that represents a huge space that we need to tap into. And then moms with kids 6 to 17, like most women, make the household purchasing decisions. Ad execs have been trying to market to mothers for years. We see this with all the Procter & Gamble commercials during the Olympics, right? Sports year-round can be a way to tap into that, not just every 4 years. All of this is to say that there's a market for female fans that's rich and not fully tapped into. But once you've cleared that first hurdle of convincing people that there's a monetary value in women's sports, you still run into the roadblock when it comes to the cultural value. Women fans don't watch women's sports. This is a huge thing that people always bring up, and that's sadly true. But I don't think it should be the burden of simply women's fans to convince management, mostly male management, that women's sports are worth something. Male fans do exist, and they just haven't been catered to, the same way women fans haven't been catered to. If you grow overall the interest among sports fans, more women are going to watch and more men are going to watch. It's not going to be stratified, because if you look at the breakdown, the way that women fans engage with their sports is very similar to the way that male fans engage with their sports. They like the same sports in the same order, the same amount. But they're just not being exposed to the women's side of it. There is a slight distinction. While women do mostly watch men's sports, they do care that women's sports are being covered. And that's something that we can really, really tap into, because they care that, you know, they want the game highlights, they want the actual events on, they want to watch all of these things, but they also want to watch a female perspective. They want to read a female perspective. They want the stories about these women athletes that maybe they can relate to on a more personal level. And that's a really different kind of way to attract these fans. And that does come to the coverage, that does come to the representation, that does come to the on-air talent and the writers and everything like that. All that need for respect, and that's what your female fan mostly says, is that we want women to be treated with respect in this space. All of that brings us to the cultural undervaluing of women's sports, and by extension, women's sports fans. You can make all the empirical arguments for how covering sports can boost your bottom line, but they won't make any impact until we start to think of them as worthy instruments of our culture and entertainment. The fiscal undervaluing of women's sports is based largely on the perceived value of women athletes as less than, and that's a conversation that's impossible to have without talking about how our society values masculinity over femininity. The age-old argument against women's sports was that athleticism was antithetical to femininity. We had all kinds of crazy theories about the impact of playing sports on a woman's fertility and things like that. Assumptions about the limitations of her strength and stamina. For some, it was unnatural to watch a woman just sweat and exert herself. Hopefully the fertility thing has been cleared up by now. But many of those attitudes abound and are often used precisely to devalue women's sports. Women's tennis players shouldn't get paid as much because they only play 3 sets instead of 5. Meanwhile, the women tennis players have been fighting to be able to play 5 sets for years now and have been told that they can't physically handle it. So don't use that argument against them. Tennis is a great thing because we have Serena Williams. And Serena is just a flash mob of every issue that we've talked about today. She, from the idea that anything could be physically out of her reach, which I haven't seen anything she can't physically do yet, to the sexism and racism that is often employed when talking about her body, whether it's the framing of her to fans, whether she looks too manly, whether, you know, she's only successful and strong because she's taking performance-enhancing drugs, which is an accusation that flies about with absolutely no basis whatsoever. But she's also really interesting because in the context of sexualizing athletes, she owns her sexuality in a way that isn't commodified. She's been able to be an athlete first, and yes, a sexy, beautiful, could be a model woman second. I wrote a column when I first started at ESPN around the Olympics about how attractive I find Connor Dwyer, Olympic swimmer. And I basically used it as a joke to kind of start discussing, you know, how objectifying male athletes can be okay. Objectifying female athletes can be okay. The problem is we don't do it in the same way. If we did, then if we started from the same starting point, then it would make sense to do it in the same way, but we don't. What we do is the male athlete is an athlete first and a good-looking guy second. The female athlete is a good-looking girl first, and maybe you consider her athletic ability after you consider how hot she is. That's a really problematic way of how we're framing things, and I think that that's one of the things that we need to work on. Serena's also a great example for why we don't just undervalue individual athletes, but the quality of the sport. Her success is used against her as a marker of how weak the field is. The same thing with UConn basketball, right? You're talking about 2 incredibly dominant winning programs and people whose success is completely used against them as a sign of how weak their field is. Now, yeah, the field is weaker, but the solution isn't to disrespect them or blame them for that. The solution is to help the field grow by telling girls that there are other programs out there, by showing them Mississippi State instead of UConn, and by showing that there are more options to being successful than just the one. Thank you.
Well, thank you all panelists. I really would like to start this discussion among the three of you, and then maybe later when we get to the public Q&A. And it's this whole notion of why aren't women covered more? And I heard that on the previous panel and now today. And I want to push us to say this. It is true that women are overlooked, and it is true that women are underutilized. And I would argue from a critical feminist perspective that is precisely the point. It is not, I don't believe, that key decision makers don't understand that there are market imperatives where they could, that there is this untapped market. I think that they refuse to acknowledge that there is an untapped market because I have come to believe, after being told for 30 years that nobody's interested, this is what I believe the biggest concern is on key decision makers, and I want to hear what you say. I think the biggest fear is not that no one is interested, but that if the audience were given half a chance and women's sports were promoted anywhere near the way that men's sports were reported, far too many people would be interested, and then they would no longer be the center of the universe, monopolizing, again, this enormously important institution. So I really want us to stop thinking about this in terms of they're undervalued and they're underutilized, because I think that that's exactly what they're supposed to be, so that we continue to be marginalized. So I don't know how you want to react to that.
I think there is something to be said for that. At the same time, I think the money really does speak for itself. If you talk to these people one-on-one, and they're not just male executives, there are women in management positions who really do wish that they could do more to prioritize women's games and air them more, and they really do feel hampered by the fact that, you know, this is how we've done things, and this is how we've been making our money, and we can't see a future in which this has changed. I think there is something to be said for the power structure, because that's who is making these decisions. If you had more women in team executive, league executive, editorial executive, management executive, advertising executive positions, then I think you would start to see that sea change. And I think you do when you finally do have a woman in the room. How many times have we seen an ad or a programming decision and thought, there was no woman in the room when that happened, you know? And I think that's a function of that, so.
Yeah, but I want to push back just a little bit and say, we've never given women's sports the opportunity to be covered in the way that men's sports are covered, to see if there would be a financial advantage. And so, I mean, again, it does become this chicken and egg. And I would ask us to think about what powerful forces are at work that would prevent key decision makers from really acting against their own financial interests. That's my only argument.
If I could, yeah, it's a great way to put the question. I think because for me, it's part of, I don't know as much about the financial side or how decisions are made behind the closed doors of media organizations, but to me, I think it's really important to think about gender in sport and gender in sports media in terms of broader historical power relations between women and men, and the ways in which, you know, sport as we know it as an institution really took shape in the mid-20th century, and football emerges at a time when, in the post-World War II era, when you know, Rosie the Riveter, they were at least trying to send Rosie the Riveter home and reasserting a gendered public domestic split. And then within a couple decades, feminism emerges, and I think it's right around that time that football becomes more and more popular, as Mariah Burton Nelson pointed out with that great title of her book, The Stronger Women Get, the More Men Love Football. And I think there's something, I interviewed a former athlete, male former athletes years ago, and one quote that stuck in my head and I've used many times in things that I've written is a guy who I asked him about his workplace. He hadn't played sports for years. He worked in a professional workplace, and I asked him if he had women working at his level or higher, and he said, look, a woman can do the same job as me and maybe even be my boss, but I'll be damned if she can go out on the football field and take a hit from Ronnie Lott. the great defensive back who was known for exploding people with his body. And if you could have seen this guy, you would have realized that he too couldn't have taken a hit from Ronnie Lott. And about 99.99% of men could not have taken a hit from Ronnie Lott and lived to tell about it. But Ronnie Lott existed for him as a media image to which he attached a sort of ideology of male superiority. And sport then came to be this institution, and especially mediated sport came to be this institution that reinforced this binary and this hierarchy between men and women, and Mary Jo pointed out with such a great article a number of years ago that when women start playing sport more visibly and we watch them and we support them, what's revealed is not that women and men are from Mars and Venus and separate and very separate and totally categorically different, but instead there's this continuum of difference that's revealed empirically between the abilities of women's and men's bodies. That knowledge is it's very threatening and to an entrenched system of male entitlement. I'm really happy some people were talking earlier this morning about, what's it like, and Leila Ali was talking like, what's it like for her son to see competent girls playing alongside. And I had this experience when my sons were growing up. My younger son, I took them all to all the USC women's basketball games with me for a number of years. And I think there's a whole generation of boys that have grown up seeing and even playing alongside girls who are extremely competent and sometimes just beat their butts at whatever they're playing. And it's the greatest experience for a boy to have. But as long as the mass media isn't covering this in any way that's equitable or symmetrical, then all of those kinds of gains on some level, because social change takes place at the interpersonal level, at the structural level, and at the sort of symbolic institutional level. If it's not happening at the symbolic level, then in some ways it's really just not happening. So to me, that's why it's so important to think about the media coverage of women in sports, in part because of fairness. If women, men have a right to do one thing and get paid for it, women should too. But for me, it's because media coverage of women is part of this broader system that's really in flux, but it ultimately has to do with the ways we think essentially about women's and men's bodies as being different and inferior and superior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just wanted to add that I do a lot of my research in Korea and Asia, and in many of these contexts, women are a large part of the media coverage because they are symbols of the nation. And I think that connection is important to think about in terms of why women's coverage rises during the Olympics, and whether being a symbol of the nation then supersedes the fact that they're women, and it makes it acceptable during the Olympics. And so I think that it's important to think about the ways in which gender and nation work in sports.
Well, go ahead.
I just wanted to add on to that. It's a great point. It came up a couple times earlier today in a different sort of way, in the ways that in the United States, coverage of women athletes just really spikes during the Olympics, and we suddenly have these female heroines that we all know and become household names, and people sometimes get very hopeful that that's going to kind of spill over after the Olympics ends, but it doesn't. It seems to just kind of evaporate back to a baseline again. And I've wondered how and why that happens, and I'd love to hear from people who work within the media about how and why that happens. But for me, what it says, the story it tells to me, is that that nationalism trumps sexism. I know I hate to use that word as a verb now, but it still works. I think that somehow the way the media coverage of women happens between all these Olympiads is just shot through with all this sexism. But suddenly, when we have, quote, our girls who are going to go and win medals for us, and that we can all identify, in a nationalistic sort of way with them, then suddenly they become people that we identify with and lavish a lot of attention upon.
But I think that happens because it's safe. It's every 4 years, and it's not football. And so, I think that's in a safe space to be able to do that, where nationalism, I don't want to say trumps either, trumps sexism. I wanted to we have 30 seconds before we open this up. I wanted to ask Rachael a question. I assume that no male Korean golfers have surgery. Is that, and the other question that I have is there any backlash or feminist critique of these surgeries in South Korea?
I think increasingly men are doing it. If
They are.
They are in like a media, like a visible arena, like a visual arena. It's increasingly acceptable for men. And it's interesting because the critique is less about gender as it is about opportunity, economic opportunity. And so it's seen as a way to advance opportunity in an economy where visual images are so important to one's opportunities. So I think that, I mean, there is the gender critique, but I think that many, even feminists think that it's more important to think about was the economy such that, you know, individuals feel that they have to do this.
Interesting. Okay, well, we now want to open it up to the audience, and we would welcome your questions. Please, just as a reminder, just tell us who you are and focus on the question.
Yep. Hi, my name is Deborah. I'm a Harvard alumna, but I'm here today in my capacity working with a small all-women's college in the area who is considering starting a sports management concentration. We've been doing a lot of research and would love to infuse the curriculum with this perspective. We want to graduate women who are not only competitive in the marketplace, but also will be change agents. If you had to make one or two suggestions about what you'd like to see in a curriculum for specifically women going into sports management, what would it be?
Well, I think that they should read the work that Mike and I do.
Okay.
I actually, when I first got out of graduate school, I taught in sport management programs. I think, again, it's central to doing a gendered analysis of what is happening here. And I always take everything back to power. And the reason that I say that is folks here in New England are going to remember the story. We talked about it at lunch, where a sports reporter for the New England Patriots was sexually harassed in the locker room. Her name was Lisa Olson. And I remembered sitting at NASM, which is the North American Society for Sport Management's professional organization, and everyone was deploring how horrible this was. And it was horrible, but the punchline from all of the sort of academics and scholars was, this is horrible because nobody benefits when this kind of thing happens. And I thought, no, that's not true, actually. Men benefit when these kinds of things happen because then women don't want to go into those locker rooms and women don't want to go into those professions. And so I think that would be, I would hope, central to any sort of analysis in a sport management curriculum. I don't know if you all want to say?
I will say that it was a class that I lobbied to take at the School of Sports Management at Columbia when I was a freshman. That is the reason that I'm here today. It was called the Socio-Historical Foundations of American Sport, and it basically taught me about how sports could be used as a cultural lens, and that's basically how I approach every single one of my writings right now. It was incredible to put what can seem kind of frivolous into historical context, and simple things like baseball specialization accompanying the assembly line, and seeing how that was just reflected in our nation's history and global history in some ways too. I think that could be really important. As far as the sexual harassment thing, I've been sexually harassed in a locker room and it's never stopped me from going back in, so.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name is David Tannenwald. I'm a freelance writer in Cambridge, and I really enjoyed the discussion. And one of the things that struck me is that politics is a big theme in all of this. There were jokes about Trump, talk about nationalism, and I was curious what you think about comparing inequity in sports journalism with journalism in the political arena, particularly after the presidential election. Is it better? Is it worse? Is it more of the same?
That's good. Go ahead.
I think it's worse in sports journalism. I think it's the worst in tech and finance journalism. Politics actually tends to be have a little bit more parity than the rest of journalism that isn't culture and fashion. And that's not to denigrate culture and fashion journalism, by the way. I think that it's harder to be a woman in sports journalism with an eye toward politics, which is kind of how I approach my writing, but it's a really fine line, especially, when you're not a freelancer. But I think that it's definitely harder in sports, and there are just fewer of us. If you look at the White House press pool, there are more than 2 women. If you go to a press conference after a game as a woman, you'll notice if there's another woman there. So.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Walter Harper, anthropologist. I'd like to ask a two-pronged, just one question. It concerns or focuses on the Williams sisters. Is my sentiment that what they both experienced is as bad, if not worse, than what Jackie Robinson experienced when he broke into baseball? And I'm just of the impression that there hasn't been enough said about it, especially when they say that you look like a man or they are a man. And then secondly, what about the racism against the Euro-American women or the European women that they play against? It seems to me on many occasions that their racism is as bad as what outside people are saying, outside of tennis, regarding the Williams sisters. I haven't seen any journalists say enough about it. I've never seen a big ad in the New York Times saying this has to stop. This is just unacceptable. And that's why I'm asking the question.
Panelists?
I have to ask for clarification on the second part of it in a second, but as far as Jackie versus Venus and Serena, I think if you look at how the media has treated Venus versus Serena, kind of highlights the racism that they've experienced, which is, Venus did everything right, the way that Jackie kind of had to take everything in stride, right? He had to be the gentleman, he had to put his head down and just play the game and win. Venus is naturally just a quieter person. She's not as showy, but the word that's often bandied about is she's elegant and she's classy. And the subtext is Serena's not. Serena's a showy, passionate person, and that's one of the reasons she's such a great competitor. And both of them are incredible winners. But I think that if you look at the different treatment, and if you talk to fans who don't think that they're racist and hate Serena but love Venus, there's a very distinct reason there, and that's because of the expectation for Black people, especially Black women, to keep their head down and their mouths shut even when they're winning at the levels that they are.
Well, I also think you can't separate the fact that you have 2 very different body types. Mm-hmm. And when you look at Serena Williams and her body type, it's enormously threatening to what a woman's body should look like, even as a tennis player. And she has been resolutely unapologetic about her body and about her power. And I admire her greatly for that. But I also think that is also a huge difference between how Serena versus Venus Williams is covered.
But that's my whole point, What's the difference then between Serena and Sarah Bartman? I mean, this has been going on for a long time, but what concerns me is there hasn't been, to me, enough sentiment saying that this has to stop and is unacceptable, especially when little African-American girls could be seeing all this, and that might prompt them not to want to play tennis, to go through that.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, thank you.
So I write about this almost every week. I've probably written 17 articles about the treatment that Serena's had.
And I've read a couple of it, but I don't think it's enough.
Well,
I've read a couple, but thank you very much.
Somebody else has to besides you, right?
Hi, my name's Barbara Wolfinger. I'm a retired mathematician from North Andover, but I happened to watch the semifinal UConn game, and I rooted for UConn, being from Connecticut. And I was disappointed they lost, but very excited an incredible game. So much so that I even had to watch the final and root for Mississippi. Lost again. But my question actually relates to a question posed by one of the Talking Heads ESPN shows. I can't keep them all straight. My husband has them on all the time. Posed a year ago. And the question was, and I was shocked at the time, is UConn women's basketball team bad for women's sports? And the statistics quoted earlier about how many people watched the semifinals, and it was because UConn lost. And how they lost, and how exciting it was, and then how exciting it made the final game because UConn lost. At least that's how I interpret it. So it made me think back a year ago to that question. Did the dynasty that UConn represent end up being bad for women's sports? So I'd be interested in your opinions.
I'll just take one first crack at that, and then others can chime in. Thank you for that question, too. I've been paying attention to that, too. People have been saying that about the UConn women's program. And, you know, as someone who has been watching college basketball since long before the rise of the women's game, I remember very fondly admiring so much the UCLA men's basketball dynasty when Lou Alcindor and others were playing, and later Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And they didn't win quite as many championships in a row as UConn did, but they, for a decade or for 12 years, they were almost always there and won almost all the time and had a long, long win streak. I don't remember anybody ever saying this is bad for men's basketball. Of course, just bad for basketball, because they wouldn't even think it's just men's basketball right at that time. And so, you know, my sense is that that UConn women's basketball team has raised the profile of women's basketball greatly. And it's, yeah, I mean, I'm happy that Mississippi State beat them, because I just kind of gotten on with their storyline. I was happy about them having watched them against Baylor. You know, maybe it's good for basketball, too, that they got beaten. And probably they'll be back next year and start a big, long streak again, you know, but they're not going away. So I think it's a double standard, you know, that's placed on a really high-quality program that, in my view, probably, and it'll be really clear in retrospect that this is something that brought women's basketball up to another level.
Yeah, and I would go with the whole issue, not only the UCLA John Wooden comparison, but the notion of a rising tide lifts all boats. And one of the great things that we love about sports is, you know, a David and Goliath story. And that's exactly what we had. And that the fact that Mississippi State beat them was phenomenal. And that would not have been an iconic moment had they just beaten any other team but Connecticut, because nobody thought that anybody would beat Connecticut, and certainly not Mississippi State. So, I mean, I think Gino and they've been great for women's basketball.
And I just wanted to add that the coverage of the UConn fans, I think, has done a lot for women's sports, because they're just, you know, as rabid and excited as any other fans.
Yeah, I started to talk about this, and then I ran out of time. I had about a page and a half left of things to say. It's the same thing with Serena. It's the same thing with UConn. The argument is that the field isn't good enough, the sport isn't good enough. And honestly, we don't see that, as Mary Jo and Michael pointed out, we don't see that argument made about Duke and UNC. When was the last time we had a Sweet 16 without either of those teams in there? And actually, there was a statistic, I wrote it down. 22 current NBA players went to Duke. That's 5.5% of the league. So Duke is bad for basketball? Are we going to start saying that? It's only ever used against the woman. It's only ever used against Serena and UConn. I will say that, I mean, we love the drama. We love the upset, absolutely, and that did help. It will help in recruiting. And I think that because you now have, and again, this goes back to my point that the solution here to strengthen the field isn't to completely dismiss the sport or to blame the dominant team. It's to try and elevate the coverage. Because the coverage was elevated, because the drama was so compelling, you're now going to have high school women's basketball players considering Mississippi State, considering committing to Mississippi State instead of maybe UConn, or not instead of, but in addition to, because now they know they have another school that they could possibly win a title at.
Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Arlen Baer, and I'm a senior at Clark University. I'm extremely interested in sports radio. And more often than that, that's very marketed towards the male viewer and can often be very crude. And how would you break the stigmatization of women's sports and incorporate that even in that kind of crude atmosphere?
So the Trifecta airs at between noon and 3 every Saturday on ESPN Radio, and it's hosted by Jane McManus, Sarah Spain, and Kate Fagan, and occasionally yours truly. I think that it's really starting to get I mean, the show itself is very successful. Overall, we are having a lot more exposure of female voices, both on television and on radio. We see Jamel Hill is co-hosting SportsCenter at 6 every day right now. I don't know what the actual solution is other than to just give us a chance because, and you know, we don't always talk about women's sports. It's probably not even the majority of what we talk about, but we talk about them when they're definitely worth talking about it, and you won't get that coverage elsewhere, so.
There's a sports studies scholar, David Nyland, who's written a book on sports talk radio, and you know, what somebody earlier today called it sports screaming radio or something, I can't remember. But you know, looking at it, I mentioned earlier sort of that I'd been thinking about SportsCenter as a kind of symbolic man cave, I think, in some ways. And Nyland's analysis of sports talk radio is kind of that too. It's a place where guys go to get not just kind of to have fun, just to talk sports, but what's happening below the surface is having certain narrow conceptions of masculinity reinforced through their banter with each other. So, you know, I've been a couple times invited to come on those shows, and I did once, and I regretted it, and so call me weak-kneed, but I say no thank you from now on about going on those shows.
And I won't do them either. I won't. It's just. Yeah. It's not worth it.
I think it also matters if it's a call-in show and if it's not, because the ones that aren't tend to have more thoughtful voices, and they tend to, you know, and the call-in shows are literally just fans, and this is what goes back to the man cave thing. A lot of what's wrong with the male sports fan and the way that we cater to him is that he thinks of these athletes as substitutes for himself and his own failed ambitions, and he can't do that with women. So when we don't have call-in shows, we don't have, you know, Joe from Staten Island calling to yell about the Knicks, then we tend to have more serious discourse.
Yeah, exactly. We have time for one more question.
Hi there, thank you all for being here. It's been really great. My name is Connor, I go to Tufts University. I'm majoring in film and media studies and minoring in sociology, so this has been perfect. I have a question for Ms. Davidson, but also for the whole panel. I was wondering how you would respond to the initial backlash of ESPNW, because it's obviously like a subset of ESPN, and does that contribute to othering women continually? Because there's obviously not ESPN-M or something.
So this is a really interesting question, and this is something that we have internal discussions about all the time. The initial criticism of creating W, and I was nowhere near this. I don't even think I was at Bloomberg. I think I was in college when this happened. Was that it would create a, quote, pink ghetto for women's sports and for women's sports coverage because it would be siloed somewhere else. And the answer to that, and what we've seen in the numbers, and I think I originally did conceptualize that happening, what we've actually seen bear out is that, yes, a lot of the women's content stays on W, doesn't get promoted on the homepage, doesn't get read by the general fan. But that content wouldn't exist at all if W didn't exist. And the content that is of higher interest that does get pushed out, my columns, Jane's columns, you know, all the coverage about women's basketball, Michelle Vopel's our amazing basketball correspondent, would not make it to the front page if we didn't have a W. We also wouldn't have certain SportsCenter things. We did the ESPN the Magazine, and W's editor-in-chief became the editor-in-chief of ESPN the Magazine last year, Allison Overholt. She was the first woman ever to be the editor-in-chief of a sports magazine, a major sports magazine. Did a 20th anniversary cover for the WNBA that was nominated for a major magazine award. That wouldn't have happened without W. That wouldn't have happened without leadership like Allison. So I do see that criticism, and we do have a ways to go to make our content more visible, but I think that content wouldn't even exist if we didn't have a W.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all the panelists. They were fabulous. And also the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. Again, it's meant a lot to me as somebody who's been doing this for 30 years to be invited to a place like this to have this kind of a conference.
Thank you, and it's our honor to have you guys. I'm Janet Rich Edwards. I am the Director of Life Sciences here at Radcliffe, and it's my pleasure to be able to do a couple minutes of wrap-up before we send you to the reception. We've covered a lot of ground today. We started with Egyptian stickball, with women handing bouquets to male athletes, and got to a place today where we had Layla Ali and Christine Brennan, I think, agreeing that the glass is half full. And I will say that for women of a certain age, we've seen a lot of change. I can tell you that in 1970, small town Ohio, where I was 8 years old, I really wanted to play baseball. I loved the smell of the gloves, the sound of that ball, but they wouldn't let a girl on the team. So instead, I took baton twirling lessons. My little sister, 2 years younger than I am, got on that team. It's very sad she still can't twirl a baton, but it's made a big difference in her life. And I can say that my daughters, 45 years after Title IX, are Division I rowers and marathon runners, and those girls are not just visiting. To use your words, I thought that was great. But this social change is incomplete. Women make up 55% of our college students, but 43% of our college athletes, we learned today. I was shocked that 43% of NCAA teams are coached of women's teams are coached by women, only that. And that only 1 out of 5 athletic directors is a woman. More depressing still, that 2% of coverage of sports is apparently coverage of women athletes. It is good news that it's less sexualized and trivialized than it used to be, so that's progress, but there's a long ways to go there. I think even in our bright spot every 4 years, the Olympics, where recently half of the athletes were women, where the gold medals for men weigh the same as the gold medals for women, and where we get decent coverage. Even there, 38% of the national flag bearers are women. A baton twirler would notice that. And only 11% of the heads of the national missions, the chefs de mission, are women. So it strikes me that this is something of a pipeline. It's a pipeline like we see for academics, for women in academics, but it's a pipeline we cannot take for granted. We need women as athletes, as the role models that they are, whether they want to be or not. We need mentors, we need coaches. We talked today about speaking up. We talked about the roles of parents, and a special shout out a couple of times to the role of fathers. We've talked about the athletes themselves, the current athletes speaking up, and the former athletes. I think an increasingly vocal and important voice, both to promote the sport, but also to warn us of the dangers we heard about today, the sort of dark side of athletics, the injuries, the doping, the pressure. We've heard many calls today to generate more data, more hard evidence that will serve to ignite advocacy. Data about who is watching, data about who is playing, and data, if Parissa Safai is still here, about who is not playing, which is very important. I was also struck by our need to lawyer up the importance not only of legislation, but of regulations. The devil is in these details. That's very important for us as advocates and a role for leadership. And of course, the media that destabilizes these boxes of sex and gender, and the role of places like ESPNW, which gets more coverage, which will eventually generate more interest. I also very much liked our rights-based framing. As Stephanie Wheeler said, the right to get to that starting line, whether it's disability, your gender, or as Parissa Safai said, about poverty, the right to true sport, and the right to safe sport. These are communal, socially determined access, not frills for the powerful and the privileged. And we talked about sports. I was moved by this. This was Anita DeFrancis' comment. Sports as an expression of the humanity of spirit. We talked about it being a zone of excellence where confidence and respect prevail, where there's a sense of community, and also of sport as a microcosm of our world. So at the end of today, I hope we go away inspired to enjoy our rights, to protect them, to advance them, and to cheer at the top of our lungs for our right to sport. So thank you so much for coming today. Thank you to our many panelists who just hit the ball out of the park.